We're happy this morning to welcome Duane Jones, founder of the Art Pays Me brand. Art Pays Me is a lifestyle brand and a podcast founded in Halifax by Duane in 2011. He's an artist and designer who moved to Halifax from Bermuda in 2000 to attend Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And after graduating, he started a family here and decided to plant some roots in Canada. His motivation to start that brand came from years of frustration over the way that creative people are viewed in a business setting. So his mission is to motivate people to embrace their creative strengths to achieve their financial and creative independence on their own. So really pleased to welcome Duane to build on that for us this morning and present his talk on building an art-led business. So welcome, Duane.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, everybody. So I guess I will share my screen. Okay, so welcome to my talk. And so I'm just gonna, I think Greg pretty much covered who I am and what I'm about. So thank you for that. And we'll go right into what is an art-led business. So in my experience, taking from this definition, art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. So, art in a lot of ways isn't necessarily just about being able to draw, being able to paint, like people traditionally say. To me, like you can find art in pretty much any factor of life. I think there are business people who are artists. I think there are accountants who are artists. I think there are people who are artists all over the place just because they apply creativity and skill in a certain way. But for the sake of my talk and what I'm talking about, I'm talking specifically from a visual standpoint. So an art-led business for me is about sharing visual stories that I feel compelled to tell. Sometimes those stories are initiated by me. Sometimes they are initiated by a client or a collaborator that I'm helping push forward. So because we live in a society that requires money to survive, I have to assign value to that. So that becomes work. My art becomes work and becomes a business. So I'm going to take you through my background, how I established this business in creativity, and some of the various platforms that it's on, some frameworks that I use to manage it all. So I'll take it through my background. Greg kind of touched on it a bit. I grew up in Bermuda. This is my parents and my brother and I. And my mom was an executive assistant at AIG, which is an American corporation that based in Bermuda. My dad was a taxi driver and he was a professional musician. And I didn't realize how significant of an example there would be to my development in life later on. And my mom's influence kind of came first. She's very practical, pragmatic. She's a planner. And, she set aside money so that I could study in university, like when I was younger than that, probably. So I definitely inherited her pragmatism because I wanted to be an accountant, actually, when I grew up. I didn't want to be an artist, even though I always identified as one as a kid. But one thing they also both let us know that, as Black men, we're going to have to work a lot harder than our white counterparts when it came to work. And they expressed the importance of university education so that when we did finish school, we'd be able to compete. And we basically didn't really have a choice. We were just told from young, you're going to university, you're going to university. So, and part of the reason they felt this way is because, they had experienced racism directly. And Bermuda's majority Black country, to preface it, but there's still, it's a British colony. So that colonialization still carries through to this day. So despite what the numbers are. So, my mom worked for AIG, and in her experience, a lot of qualified Black Bermudians would be overlooked for roles because they would keep importing people from the UK, from Canada, from the US, who are often white and got, much higher roles in the company. So, they just wanted us to be as prepared as possible so that when we're faced with these scenarios, we could say, hey, look, I've got the education, I've got the qualifications, and you can't hold me down. Another thing that I found interesting, so when I was older, I used to watch my dad leave home. He played music in the evenings pretty much every night of the week, drove taxi during the day. But I never really thought of what he did as art. But now I do. And especially since I interview a lot of musicians on my podcast, I really get to see that sort of creative side and how that works. And I also, didn't really think of what my dad did as a taxi driver. I thought of it just as a job, but ultimately I found out later that it was a business because he owned two taxis. One he drove himself and one he leased out to someone else. So he was kind of doing this dual dance that I do right now, where you're working and you're hustling as an artist in other ways. So Berkeley Institute, that's the high school that I went to. I was a pretty good student in primary school. My high school was a public school, but everyone had to wear uniforms. And but the thing is, it required an exam to get into. So both of my parents had gone to Berkeley. It was a little bit prestigious. Uh, I did score high enough to get into the school, but then once I got there, I started to really struggle academically and socially. And I wanted to be an accountant, and I took all the classes in high school that I needed, but it just wasn't going great, and the school wouldn't allow me to continue taking them. But I did do really well in English and art. I had a lot of visible examples of success in my life. So, a lot of times uh, Black folks will come on and will say that they hadn't seen examples of Black excellence or Black success as much as they would have liked. And I can't say that I didn't. I had a doctor in my family. I had executives in my family that did well for themselves. So I had seen that, but what I hadn't seen was successful artists. And the only artists that were successful I was aware of were, your usual European suspects. And to my knowledge, the only way you could be successful doing that was after you die. Uh, so, but then at some point in high school, I discovered comic books. I fell in love with that art form, and you know, I decided, maybe that's what I could do. Maybe I could be a comic book artist since this accounting thing doesn't seem to be in the cards for me anymore. But then that would change when my art teacher in high school would put me on the path that I'm on today. And he said, my art, it's got a graphic quality to it. And he thought that I'd be good at graphic design. I had no idea what graphic design was, but I was like, sounds good, cool. When I graduated, I barely got out of high school, barely graduated, but I got into Bermuda College, and at Bermuda College, I had a great experience. I was on the basketball team. I just started to figure out my learning style, so my grades had improved a lot, and I was doing a lot better. And it didn't hurt that a lot of my classes were focused on art and design because I was in the art and design program. So I learned a lot of design fundamentals. I learned a lot of theory, color theory, and did a lot of illustration and painting. And I used to enter a lot of group shows at galleries in Bermuda, and I was able to sell my first piece of art doing that. So it was funny. Like one day, uh, I entered into this group show, and I did a painting of this Shaolin monk. At that point, I had been doing Shaolin Kung Fu for like 10 years. So this was like a big passion of mine as well, and just really personal to me. So I did this painting, never wanted to sell it, never wanted to get rid of it or anything. It was just going to be something that I did for myself, but I wanted to exhibit it. And the gallery for this group show that I was in, they called me and they said, "Hey, this these Americans from some American Shaolin school in New York, they want to buy your painting." And I was like, "Well, I don't know. I'm not interested in selling it." So I just made up a number. I was just like, if they want it, they can have it for $1,000. Because to me, at that point, $1,000 was like $1,000,000. Like, there's no way anyone's going to buy anything of mine for $1,000. And they said, okay, this was $1,000 US. They called me back and they said, yeah, they'll take it, but they didn't say 1,000. They'll pay 750. And then I was like, you know what? I like this painting, but I think I'll let it go for 750. So I broke and I sold it. And so that should have been kind of a sign for me to double down on things. But I had at that point, I think I was really more interested in graphic design. But my highest level of education that you could get at Bermuda College was an associate's degree, and what my parents talked to me about, and about being competitive and needing to excel more and do better than everyone else. That wasn't going to be good enough for me. So I wanted to get at least a bachelor's degree, and that meant having to leave the country. So I looked at the States, I looked at Canada, and I looked at the UK. And one of my art history teacher at Bermuda College suggested NASCAD. So I applied to NASCAD and I got into the design program there. So moving to Nova Scotia was, was a real cultural adjustment for me. I traveled a lot before NASCAD. I had seen snow. I had experienced some other cultures, but I'd never lived anywhere else before. So it took time to being used to being the only Black person in a room. And, my experience in Bermuda was always the opposite of that. So, I looked different, I dressed different, I had an accent that nobody recognized. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't considered a nerd. And, because it was like, I dressed like a rapper to people anyway. And that didn't compute. Black guy dresses like this. You can't be a nerd at the same time. So in some ways, it was cool being different, standing out and everything else, but like being othered all the time, being stared at, it's frustrating. And, I also picked up on this other thing that like people would warn me about certain places to go and not go, and communities that were dangerous. And those communities always tended to be Black people. So I was like, what's that about? And then I meet people from these communities and they'd be nothing like the stereotypes. So getting back to NASCAD, like I love NASCAD. I loved my experience there. I loved it just felt like a real art school, just like I had always imagined. But that cultural issue translated to my experience there as well. So sometimes I find myself having to present a design critique, to present a design, or even I did a lot of art and illustration courses too. And when you have to do a more conceptual piece, sometimes your cultural influence plays a big part in that. And people didn't often understand where I was going with those cultural references. So, but at the same time, I was always expected to understand their cultural references. So, you would get critiqued pretty harshly, and the critiques would be in front of the entire class. So sometimes you just be like, damn, I might just suck. Do I just suck at this? But it all kind of changed for me when I did this class on rhetoric with Hanno Esses. And, rhetoric really broke down the theory behind visual communication. And if you understood the theory, then you realize my cultural differences became beneficial because they offered me perspective that others didn't have. So, after graduating from NASCAD, I started looking for work. I was concerned about being pigeonholed as a Black designer. I wanted to just be a great designer, period. I didn't really want to do specifically Black-centered work. So I didn't always go after certain clients because of that. But I want to dig into why, you know, that's an example of how white supremacy can affect even Black people. So, I was hesitant to work with these Black clients, but because of my experience with these crits, I start to think, well, audiences won't see the value in what I have. So I was so caught up in trying to look good for white-owned agencies and trying to make myself seem more legit. And I just naively thought that my good design work could translate. And I kept being reminded that I couldn't really separate the two. My identity is a big part of who I am as a designer. And while I have the ability to design pretty much for any situation, it's not necessarily a bad thing to lean into that. So like I would find that I would encounter situations where I do a design for a client and I'd be asked to use not to use Black or brown models because the client was concerned about how they be perceived. And I didn't push back. And I kick myself to this day for not pushing back and forcing them to prevent the racism over that, because what were you trying to say? What negative, what is so negative about using Black and brown models? Like, you couldn't even get away with that today. Just even suggesting that to a designer. But anyway, my plan after graduating from NASCAD was to get a job in Toronto. But after, a connection in Bermuda connected me with some interviews with agencies in Toronto, a few months before graduating, I saw the city in a different light. And, I had a real talk experience with the creative director there, who also kind of hinted at what I've been concerned about and said, even in a city as diverse as Toronto, you're going to have a hard time getting a job as a Black designer. It's not, there aren't too many of you in this industry. So you're going to stand out. It's going to be hard for you. And I was frustrated. So, I went back to Halifax, and as an international student, I only had a certain amount of time to get work before I had to go back home. So I went back to Halifax, started looking around, and, I assumed agencies would be clamoring to get me as a newly minted NASCAD grad. They were not. And, I went back to campus, and they had some job postings, and I found this ad for a magazine, and they said they were looking for a designer to help with it. It hadn't been named yet. I met with the founder. He liked me, I liked him, and I ended up being the first employee for a magazine called Next Magazine. I ended up doing a lot for them. I didn't realize at the time, but I learned some valuable lessons by witnessing a brand and business built from the ground up. I saw the value of design firsthand. I saw how graphics I designed from the media kit were being used to convince advertisers and partners to buy into the magazine, even though the magazine didn't exist at that point, because I was allowed to sit in on a lot of those meetings. So I wish I realized how important how valuable that was at the time. It was just kind of boring to me, but I really was getting some lessons. So I knew design could help establish the brand of a magazine, but the thing I unexpectedly learned about was the importance of distribution, relationship building, partnering with established brands, and how external perception influences what a brand is beyond what we as the creators of this thing say it is. So I was so much, more than a designer as well. Like, I contributed to sales, I contributed to production, I engaged with the public as part of their nightlife team. I wrote content, I did photography, and it was almost like it was my business as well. We went from convincing people that this thing was coming to producing it and having to convince people that it was worth investing in. And then once it was something that existed, it was like, we had this great product that we believed in and that we stood behind. And then we started to expand beyond Halifax as well. Over time, though, things weren't going so great there. rumors started to flow that the magazine wasn't doing well. Paychecks started to be late. Things started scaling back. So I started to explore freelance work, and we had talked about making Next more of a agency of itself and being more service based using my skills. So I kind of started to explore that side and freelance a bit more. Then came my first platform. So Glitterati Communications. Most people know my business as Art Pays Me, but it's actually registered as Glitterati Communications. So I was never officially let go of Next Magazine, but I hadn't been paid for months. My girlfriend, now wife, and I were getting serious. We moved in together. I wasn't a permanent resident at the time, and my work permit at Next was about to expire. So I needed a new job to stay in the country. I didn't rule out moving back home. I started reaching out to agencies and companies there, and didn't really have much luck there either, because just like here, even though it's a majority Black country, the creative industry there was very much white Americans, Canadians, and Brits, and the barrier to entry was just difficult. I didn't have relationships, I didn't know anybody, and just couldn't get in. So out of desperation, my wife and I decided to start our own agency called Glitterati Communications. And I would be hired as the creative director, and we'd apply for a work permit so that I could stay in the country. Plan failed. The government didn't accept the application. But it wasn't a wasted effort, because this business was a real business. I kept it. And once I became permanent resident, I just took over the paper, the official registration, and all that kind of stuff. And the irony of me not wanting to work with Black clients in those early, fresh out of school days, was that it ended up being people like the Black Business Initiative that noticed me, offered me chances to work with them. And, it would be Black owned organizations, or at least organizations that were concerned with targeting the Black community, that would be my main sources of client work for years. So there's that. So today in 2021, this is kind of what Glitterati Communications looks like: design consulting, the product line, and then there's the podcast. And the design consulting is something I don't really promote. I'm way more focused on the product line these days, but essentially these two sort of go back and forth about which ends up being my main revenue generator. So I believe in diversifying your service and product offering, and this is to account for the inevitable downtime. So that's kind of what I mean by that sort of battle that they have with each other, because I'm also like exploring alternative interests. So the podcast ended up being somewhat of an alternative interest, and I have others as well that haven't been shown. But over time, sometimes these other things can lead into revenue generators. So here's a framework that I sort of use for my business. One, purpose. I start off by asking myself, why am I doing this? Is it for enjoyment? Is it simply a financial thing? Does it have some kind of social benefit? Social meaning, like, am I talking about gender issues or stop Asian hate or something like that? Two, revenue opportunity.
Hey, Duane, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt you for a sec. I think your slide's frozen. I don't think we're seeing the slide that you're presenting right now.
Oh, do you know what it is? Is it a black screen?
We're seeing like a PDF on half of a screen right now.
Okay.
Maybe it's just resetting. Oh, there it is. Thanks.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, that looks good now.
Was it like that the whole time?
For most of it, yeah.
Oh, no.
There we go. It's all good. Thank you.
Okay.
Dwayne.
All right, so I'll go back to revenue opportunity. Is there a way to make money doing this thing? Is it important to me? Uh, and so the product line, it needed to, it was important to make revenue. The freelancing, important to make revenue. The podcast, not necessarily. Uh, then there's also production. How will this thing be produced? Will I produce it in-house? Uh, is it outsourced production? How much will production cost? Can I make the production cost in revenue? And then there's marketing. So, what channels am I using to market this thing? How much do the channels cost? Is it free? Is it social media? Is it paid ads or something else? And then there's distribution, which was a huge thing that I learned in the next magazine days. Like, I really feel like the magazine could have done better if distribution had been figured out. So how do I deliver the product or service? Is there a cost to delivering it? And can the cost or a portion of that be billed to the customer? So design consulting. So my purpose there, first and foremost, is elevate organizations that I believe in through visual communication. Uh, that's and I didn't add the make revenue, but it's also asterisk earn some money while doing that. Revenue opportunity there, consulting fees. Production, all my design and illustrations are done in-house. So um, I don't have to outsource that. I don't have to worry about the additional cost. The only cost I have to worry about is like my, Adobe Creative Cloud fees and things like that. And then marketing, because I don't push design consulting these days. It's typically word of mouth. Someone who knows someone tends to reach out to me. And then, distribution is fairly simple. Everything is online these days, digital transfer to the client, and then the client distributes how they see fit. And then for Art Pays Me product line, so Art Pays Me was, I was looking for a way to earn money for my creativity without having clients attached. And, I tried writing, I tried making art prints, but at the time I was really getting into streetwear blogs. I love t-shirts. T-shirts incorporate a lot of what I enjoy. A good shirt requires pretty sophisticated visual communication skills. And I figured that, this is what I wanted to do. So I started a brand called Be Glitterati. That was a small line of graphic tees. And the shirt on the side there was the first, you can't really see it, but it says it's art, and then it's got pays me written in small and sort of the back. And that was sort of the precursor to what art pays me is today. So I met with my friend Bo, who had a consulting company at the time, a brand consulting company, and he helped me and his team. They helped me work out like how I could take Big Literati to the next level. And one of those things was to dig into the purpose of Big Literati and what it was really about. And a lot of what I had been designing was centered around this art, creative empowerment related messages. You can't see it as well, but the t-shirt with the rifle in it, it's a pencil that has "this is my rifle" on it, meaning just basically my weapon is my art sort of idea. So I kept leaning into that unintentionally. So they suggested, what if you just go full bore into it and rename the whole thing as Art Pays Me? I had already been using that on social media a lot, and it was just, it really made a lot of sense. So I rebranded to Art Pays Me. So the purpose of Art Pays Me is to provide accessibly priced clothes and accessories that promote creative and social empowerment. Um, it's, and of course, be able to make that at a profit. So the revenue opportunity is product sales. What I do with the product sales is I again lead into diversity even within there. So I try to offer a range of products that are from say like $4 to $85. That way people who want to buy into the brand can buy into it at multiple levels. You don't necessarily have to buy the big ticket item. You can buy something smaller just to say I'm on board. And I also try to keep, without overburdening myself, but just a range of products that do different things, from t-shirts to sweaters to hoodies to stickers. And production, all the design and illustration is done internally by me. Uh, I do outsource production of blanks. I typically order my blanks from a company in Ontario called Jericho. And all my printing and embroidery is done locally in Nova Scotia. Say It With Stitches by Design. I've worked with a few other companies that do all of that stuff for me. So I have to consider cost of production when I'm doing all of this, the time it takes for things, and then am I pricing in a way that I can make that money back? So some people would do print on demand services. I think like Redbubble might be one of those type of companies. But I personally would rather have more control over how the production process goes. So I do hold inventory, which is a riskier thing. It's a more financially risky thing, and it's logistically sometimes a pain. So that's pretty much how I structure my business. I buy blanks, get stuff produced, hold the inventory, and then figure out how to market it. So social media is my main way of getting the word out for the brand. I tend to use Instagram a lot, but I have a website. I found like having an actual website is a good marketing tool just because it establishes credibility, even if it doesn't get a ton of visits. My social media pages get way more eyes on them when I look at the analytics, but just having that actual spot seems to help. And then there's word of mouth. The more people that buy from you, the more they're going to talk about it. So that's always helpful. I've been exploring brand partnerships here and there. I have a newsletter that I don't send out nearly enough, but that helps. I do paid advertising. That is hit or miss for me. So that could be better. And then press is always good. And then the Art Pays Me podcast. So I actually started the podcast as kind of a content marketing tool so that I would basically have an excuse to publish something on my website every week that would generate SEO, generate interest, give people a reason to visit my website. Now it had um, it has other purposes for it too, and I'll get to it when I get there. But that was some of the thinking behind the podcast. And then there's also live events, which is technically another area of the business that I'm sort of dabbling into, but it's been a good way to market things. And that would be including like doing fashion shows and stuff like that. And distribution. So I'm primarily artpaysme.com. I do most of the distribution myself. I do have a wholesale account in Bermuda, and I've had some consignment relationships locally. And there are pros and cons to all of that. Artpaysme.com, like doing the distribution myself, means time. It means holding inventory. It means expense. Doing wholesale, sort of similar, but then you have to be able to price your items in a way that, the wholesaler is going to feel like they're getting a good deal so that when they resell it, they can price fairly to the customer. So wholesale is harder for me because my product is more expensive because of how I produce it. It's not always easy for me to give wholesalers a price that they want, and wholesale accounts, especially in the pandemic era, it's just harder to get. And one might argue that working on your website is better. And then I've also had the consignment relationships, which again, pros and cons to it. The pro is that there's less commitment on both end. The con is that you usually get a lot less of a cut in terms of what you earn financially. And they could one day just give you your inventory back and say that this didn't move, so, and then it's back to you. But the benefit is that if you have artpaysme.com, as I do, and they give it back to you, then you can sell it yourself at a better rate. So, and now we have the podcast. So like I said, the podcast was intended to be content marketing for me. But it was also because I started to just meet incredible people. I went to school with really incredible people, and just by doing the stuff I do online, I just would meet so many artists whose stories I felt I should share. And I was learning things that I thought other people should learn too. And it just became, it just made so much sense to do it. And with my background in writing for Next, and I started exploring writing at some point before I started the clothing brand and all of that. I was just kind of looking for something to do, and that kind of led to the pre-Art Pays Me podcast, which is Future Glitterati, which you could still find on Tumblr somewhere. And this is an interview I did with my friend Mo, and I recorded some of these. Some of these were just written interviews, but this is where I was like the first point where I was starting to think on these lines of content marketing and wanting to share inspirational stories about creatives. And then the real official podcast experience I had was when I worked on this podcast called Changing the Narrative. There were three of us in the beginning. Like different people came on and went as time went, but the idea was that we were all creative entrepreneurs, and we were all wanting to talk about social issues, talk about art, talk about design, and then periodically bring on people to have conversations about what they do. I ended up leaving the show, and partly because it was supposed to be along those lines of content marketing as well for me, but it became a brand in of itself, and it just became like, I have a family, I have many other commitments, and it's one of those things where you just like, I can't keep building this other thing when my own Art Pays Me brand started to fall by the wayside. So I just, when I left, that's when it really struck me that I really needed to start this Art Pays Me podcast where I can really sort of build everything at the same time and focus my energy in a more concise way. And the intent with the podcast was, just inspire people. It wasn't necessarily, you know, there to generate revenue. But the other great thing about it is just building those relationships that I was able to build. So the other interesting thing though, that's after like a year and a half of doing this thing, stuff does sort of start to happen. Advertising, brand partnership, live events start to be an opportunity that you can explore. Merch sales become a thing. So here and there, I'm finding ways that this thing that I started as a marketing tool and content tool can actually generate some revenue as well. As far as how the show is produced, I handle all the guest booking. And for me, it's important that I provide some examples of the type of creatives that I didn't get to see. So I try to keep, I try to make sure that my guests are diverse in terms of uh, everything, race, gender, what their art is. I want people to get examples, and even some of them who are not necessarily artists, but like they might be artist managers or they work in support of artists in some kind of way. Uh, I just want to show as diverse a group as possible so that people can, and you you sometimes can learn from things that come from people who aren't necessarily like you. Uh, so I do all of the editing, I do all of the uploading, I do all that stuff internally. I've entertained outsourcing production, but financially it's just not feasible at this point. I use a company called Libsyn for hosting, and I use GarageBand to do all of the editing. I keep it pretty simple. So marketing, just like the brand, it's social media, artpaysme.com, word of mouth, brand partnerships, newsletter, paid advertising. Again, I don't really do paid advertising as much. Press always helps. I've done a couple live recordings of the show, and that's always a cool thing. And then cross promotion by being featured on other podcasts is another thing that I use for marketing. Distribution, so I use Libsyn to host it, and Libsyn's great because it it feeds my show to all the major podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, and the rest. So you can, and I also host it on artpaysme.com. And the reason for that is again that SEO bit and giving people another reason to visit the website. And it's just nice to have a home base for these sort of things. And I should mention too, I didn't mention it before, but my website is hosted on Shopify actually. So like Libsyn, I like Shopify because it it gives me some analytics, and they also just take out some of the guesswork that you need as far as like how to set up an e-commerce platform and things like that. So if anyone's looking for advice on that side, you can just hit me up. I can give you some advice. So what's next for Art Pays Me? I've been exploring the idea of IP and licensing. I've applied for a trademark for Art Pays Me, so it's taken a long time. I did it before the pandemic, still waiting. So uh, figuring out that I've also been looking at independent art platforms. So I've started to lean a lot more into what it looks like for me to be a fine artist, and do I need to participate in the traditional gallery system or not? So can I turn my Art Pays Me platform that's already existing into my own gallery system that's outside of the traditional forms? Because I found that with me, one of the things is that I was spending so much time trying to get the approval of agencies or other people in the streetwear industry or whatever the case may be. And sometimes you're wasting time trying to get these people's attention when you can just build your own platform and work with the people that want to work with you. And then I've been looking into NFTs. So this is a little bit of a point of contention because NFTs, if you might have seen the media, a lot of them are selling for crazy amounts of money right now. And there's also some controversy about how much of an environmental impact they have. So they tend to apparently use a lot of electricity. So, and if people who don't know what NFTs are, it's a non-fungible tokens that, I'm not an expert at this, so I might mess it up, but you can assign these using similar technology to cryptocurrency, you can assign a unique uh, token to an art digital art piece, and you can actually assign it to physical ones too. And that way someone could buy a digital piece of art or a graphic that any of my graphic tees, I could assign a digital an NFT to make it an NFT, and they tend to be selling for a lot of money. So I'm just looking at different ways of exploring how I can participate in that. And it seems like if done right, if done ethically, it could be a great equalizer for artists because it removes the need for other platforms for us to have to sell on. And then live events. Before the pandemic, I had big plans to do a conference with with Allison Knott. We had some dreams. So just I'm not sure, but we'll see what happens with things with the vaccine rollouts and all of that stuff. But in the background there is from Moments in Culture. That was from a show that I did where, again, I wanted to do my own gallery show. It just didn't seem like it would ever happen. So I hosted a fashion show and set up paintings, and I did a dual fashion and art show, and it's one of the things that I'm sort of most proud of. It was a good turnout. So just things like that, I'm really trying to figure out for the future. So the key takeaways from what I do is find ways to build a reputation, even when you can't necessarily get a cosign from people that you want to cosign from. Figure out distribution. How do you get your service or your product to the people who care about it? Develop relationships. Do not undercut that. Do not undervalue that. I didn't do a good enough job. I'm an introvert. I would attend networking events early in my career, but I just didn't really talk much. And just, I know it's hard, but find ways to develop relationships. The podcast for me has been a good way for me to do that. Social media has been a good way for me to do that. And then diversify revenue streams. So, like I said, I have from the freelancing to, even some speaking that I'm doing now, to the product line. Try to have multiple ways to generate revenue so that when one thing slips, then you can go to another thing. And then diversify marketing streams as well. So yeah, I tend to use social media. I tend to use Instagram a lot, but as soon as they change an algorithm, something goes wrong. So don't be afraid to try different social media platforms. Don't undervalue word of mouth. Don't undervalue, another thing I actually didn't mention, but like pop-up shops. Those are good ways to not only distribute, but also market yourself and be visible in your community. Because of my family commitments and everything, I tend not to do as many of those things, and I know that that's hurting me. But you know, continuing to at least explore all of these different markets is completely helpful, and also like rely on these craft organizations and art organizations, and look into what things they can do to help you as well in terms of marketing, in terms of all of this stuff. Don't rule anything out. Give it all consideration. Thank you. That's it. Are there any questions?
Well, thanks so much, Duane. That was an awesome talk. Really appreciate just you offering that whole aspect of your experience, like that really genuine, kind of vulnerability that you showed us with your upbringing and all that. Like that's really great insight into what it takes to try and establish a business. And I'm sure that there's some people in our audience who probably have some similar experiences. I think I would guess. If anybody does have any questions, please send them into the Q&A. Yeah, that was an awesome talk. Thanks so much, Duane. We wanted to. Somebody's asking if you can show the painting that you sold earlier in the slideshow. Because there was a couple slides that we missed at the beginning where the screen was frozen. That's my bad. I tried to mentioned that to you, and my mic was muted when I tried to bring it up, so that's my bad.
Oh, that's cool. And I had the chat closed, so I missed it. Let me see if I can find it. It's kind of like cropped out too in the image.
I think that was the one that you sold to the dojo, your first painting that you sold.
Yeah. Where is the share screen thing? Oh, there it is. Jeez, we're in the middle. It's kind of cropped out, but yeah, it's just sort of the Shaolin monk in this sort of prayer hands thing.
I think it's the, oh, I see, it's in the background there. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. There's a question about as far as your podcast goes, like if anybody's interested in that, because it is a great way to build community and build your own brand, like you said, like self-promotion, content marketing. What's the startup experience like for that? Is it expensive? Is it, what's the learning curve in terms of the software that you use?
So startup cost is really not, it depends on how you go about it. So when I was on Changing the Narrative, they were more concerned with production than I am. So you could spend hundreds of dollars on a mic. I didn't. My mic was under $100 that I use now. GarageBand is free software that came with my computer that I use for editing, and hosting cost me about $27 a month. It could be less, but because I exceed the megabyte limit or something, I have to pay a higher tier. But so it's not super expensive to get into. I had already known how to use GarageBand from before, so it wasn't a learning curve. But to me, it's not that complicated a piece of software to learn, but to someone else, it might be.
Yeah. So if you really want to go bare bones, your cost could just be the hosting aspect of it, getting it out there to the different platforms.
Exactly. And like, with the other show too, we have multiple hosts. So we ended up using a mixer for the mics and all of these other things. I don't use any of that
Right.
for what I do.
Yeah, if it's just by yourself, there is free software out there that you can use that's downloadable off the internet for audio editing.
Yeah.
Cool. As far as, using these different platforms for, I don't know, building community, building opportunities, have you found it that it's been a lot local since at least in recent memory, or has it been like national, international, the opportunities that you're finding yourself accessing? Like, what's the experience been like in terms of that?
So it's been a bit of both, more local for sure. But when I started Art Pays Me, the intention was never to be a local brand. I always thought that the message was was bigger than local. And that's partly because I'm an immigrant. Maybe I just naturally think like that. But so I recently did a talk, a panel with the dean of Ontario College of Art and Design. So she found me on social media, and it's just so stuff like that comes up, and then of course people from Bermuda reach out to me. I've done stuff with people there, and yeah, like someone from Japan bought one of my early shirts. It's very weird but cool when it's people that are complete strangers from some other part of the country or world.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, the advantages, I guess, of the digital era is having access to like any kind of market that you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned too that your partner was involved in your business at one point. Is that still the case? Is that still somebody that you lean on or that supports you in a working way, or is it moral support more so these days?
Definitely more moral support. Sometimes, she'll help me sew tags into shirts and things like that. But for the most part, it's moral. Like I try to be as I'm pretty active with the family and stuff like that. So if for instance, I'm doing something like an interview or something like that, and um, it's nice to have someone who could help with the kids or help with whatever. So I don't necessarily have to do all of that sort of thing. So she helps clear blockages for me when I need to work on
Mhm.
a project or whatever.
Yeah, I just imagine, anybody who's in a partnership and is running a business probably has a similar experience where they're, uh, you know, getting help with, like you said, putting tags on things or that type of stuff where they're not directly involved in the design work anymore. But yeah,
Yeah,
I think a lot of folks can relate to that.
yeah.
Uh, there is a question. Um, Being that you do such a variety of things in a creative way, do you ever have time or have a hard time shutting off from it? Do you ever like need to escape but you can't?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel guilty 24 hours a day and I hate it sometimes. I watched that 4 hour Zack Snyder Justice League movie. And, in the back of my mind, it's like, I should be working on something else. I should be working on something else. But at the same time, and I didn't talk about this, but in the early stages of the Be Glitterati brand and everything else, like my mental health was just not in a good spot. I was grinding 24/7 and my kids were really small. So it was like, you got crying babies, you got, you know, a wife that you have to pay attention to because she's not, she's a new mom. So I can't just be buried in my computer all the time. So I would only work on my stuff when they were sleeping. And then when am I going to sleep? And then you just have a crash. So ever since then, I started going to counseling, got diagnosed with anxiety and all of these other things, and just realized this ain't worth it. I got to figure out ways to relax, play sports, go back to the things that I do for fun, so that I can be as productive as I can. And then once I started doing that, I did become more productive actually. So adding in that forced rest, even if I don't want to, has been helpful.
Yeah. We had a session yesterday with Savvy Simon. She's local here to Halifax too, and we talked a lot about that, about how it can be really tough to take yourself away from your business. Like you have to like almost schedule that time sometimes, or even if it's at the beginning of your day when you're doing something for yourself before the day actually begins, like you got to
Yeah.
find a way to carve it just to like maintain your own sanity, right?
Yeah.
If anybody else wants to chime in about their experience, they can feel free to in the chat, or if you have any more questions, please put them in. If everybody's content with that, though, Duane, just want to thank you again. That was an awesome talk. I think everybody really appreciated that based on the comments in the chat. So thank you so much again for joining us this morning. We super appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Awesome. Well, if anybody wants to join us for the next sessions that we have today, the link is in the chat right now so that you can register. Make sure you go check out artpaysme.com, Glitterati Incorporated, or Glitterati Communications, sorry, and go check out some of Duane's merchandise and his artwork on the website. And yeah, for everybody else, we'll see you in the next session at 11 o'clock with Mary Jane Copps. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us.